So through all the video we shot, I didn't actually put together an intro for this video, but I'm going to rob some footage from the previous to give you an idea of what we're doing. And I'd like to talk about the drag race aspect of this car. It's something that a lot of people never get to really see or experience, or actually somebody walk in with a camera in the car, show you how the shifter works. We're not professional racers, but this is a professional built car. It's got some really cool high-tech stuff, and I got some awesome video, really cool video on board in the car. You can see him. It's got what's called a Liberty 5-speed. So y'all already saw this run, but I'm gonna catch another glimpse here of this junkyard turd. We really intentionally left this dirty. We had nice chrome valve covers we could have thrown on it, but it just ran so good for what it looked like. It'd been in the corner of my shop so long, we just had to leave it like it was. You'll notice the headers here. This one's kind of rough looking. So Matt actually built this header over here. This was one of the things we were thrashing on, or he was thrashing on Friday night. I got kind of a fast motion he shot with his phone of him welding this up, but the header's kicked out the side. This is sort of more of an old style drag race header that kind of fits the theme of the car more than the one that's swooped down and run kind of along the frame rail. And the problem with it is that one sits so close to the ground, it hangs on everything. It really not that great a deal. Anyway, this is a really nice looking header he put together.
With a little more modern technology. It's a step header with a merge collector. They might not have done that back in the day, but we're still trying to make horsepower. So
yeah, I want to hit a few high spots on this motor. It's a really cool piece. The first thing you'll probably notice if you're a Chevrolet fan or a Chevrolet guy, the starter is on the wrong side. They actually moved the starter over here to give you better windage, oil scraping ability, if you would, of the oil pan. So as the oil is thrown off the crankshaft, it gives it sort of a place to throw it over here instead of it being stirred up and to fall back on the crankshaft. That's lost horsepower. So here's the oil pump. The oil pump is external. It does not have an internal oil pump anymore. And this is a stock Chevrolet block, isn't it? It's a bow tie block. It's a bow tie block. It is a cast iron Chevrolet block, but it does not have an oil pump in it. The oil pump is external. It pumps it through a filter, through this adapter here and back into the block. So this is the end of the camshaft. It is a belt driven camshaft. When you get into the really high speed engines, this being a 10,000 RPM motor, the belt actually gives you better control of the camshaft, or more precise control I should say. And then the distributor is driven with this little bitty timing belt off the front of the camshaft. So on the front of the crank here is a thing, I don't know if you'd call this a reluctor wheel, but it's got 4 magnets in it, and these magnets are what actually control the timing, along with a thing called a crank trigger. Now this is a crank trigger off a big block, but you get the idea. This runs right here, and as the magnet comes by this crank trigger, this is actually what tells the ignition coil or the ignition box to fire. This adjustment here is actually how you set the ignition timing. The only thing the distributor does is move a rotor to actually send the spark to the correct spark plug. It doesn't actually control the ignition timing in any way. Got a set of twin 4-barrel Hollies on it. Sheet metal intake. One more interesting thing here, these aluminum plates are header adapters, and on a small block Chevrolet, you've got all the bolt holes for the exhaust manifold are all in a line. And if you have a big tube header, the tubes effectively cover up these holes. And so what you've got to do is to take aluminum plate, make a header adapter, and change the bolt pattern. This is the old header, but it shows you the a different pattern. It's not a standard small block Chevrolet.
Okay. So this is considered a clutchless transmission. Although it still does use a clutch to take off with, it does not use a clutch to shift. And you can see these rods, all these rods on here, this is the linkage to make it change gears. See how they're all moving differently? So that's how it goes in and out of each gear. When the driver engages from one gear to the next, this transmission automatically kicks itself out of the previous gear. So it cannot be in 2 gears at once, and it does not need a clutch to shift. Technically speaking, you could put it right in first gear without using the clutch. It will go and it would be gone, but it would be a rough ride. All right, so we're trying to get a shot of this here, how the shifter works. It obviously has the shifter handle here. This is reverse. So to get this thing into first gear, if you look in the side, there's a sideways W right here. And that is what controls what gear it's in. So to get it into first, I pick this all the way up to the top and push it forward. And it pushes the linkage, which you can see move right there. That's first gear. I have to hold it in every gear. I cannot let go of the shifter. If I do, it falls all the way down. So I hold it in first. And I always take off in first, you know, if I'm just driving it around or whatever. As I'm going down the track, I have to shift it hard. So when I pull this back, it'll go into the next gate down. So it dropped down a notch and it moved the rods on top. That's third, that's fourth, that's fifth. And I'm telling you, when I shift this car, I'm not literally trying to break the shifter off, but I am hard on it because I want it to go in gear solidly. It'll tear the transmission up if it doesn't.
So what's the gear ratio in this thing, the rear gear ratio?
So the rear end ratio is a 650, which is crazy compared to what most street cars would have a 320 or something like that. A normal bracket race car would have a 456 maybe, something in that range. This has a 650. And just for driver safety, we have a drive shaft loop right here. So if anything happens where this yoke breaks or back of the transmission breaks off, drive shaft breaks, this safety loop right here is my protector. All right, this is a slipper slider style clutch. It's definitely nothing about this is stock. It's a 168 tooth flywheel ring, which is pretty standard. But this clutch is it's a single disc, 8-inch diameter clutch disc inside here. And this clutch functions in a totally different manner than what your street car would. So it has two parts to it. It has what's called base and then counter. And that all has to do with how much clutch apply this thing has. So the base is a spring that's underneath these 6 towers, and that applies the clutch with the spring just like your street car does. That's the only part of it that is remotely normal to street vehicles. But we typically don't run very much base. So technically, even in like this car, at idle, I can hold the brake, let the clutch out at idle, and it would tug the engine down but not kill it, and the car wouldn't move. But if I step on the throttle, the brakes aren't going to hold it, it's going to leave. And the way it does that is with these arms here. So this is just a 3-finger clutch. This clutch has room for 6 fingers. And if you look at this, there's a bolt right here. This bolt is all counterweight. It serves no other purpose. It's not holding anything together. It is all just based on weight. This particular one looks like it's probably an aluminum bolt with a washer there, a washer on the other side, and probably a steel nut. They make plastic nuts, they make aluminum nuts, steel bolts, aluminum bolts, all different lengths, plastic washers. Just a few grams of weight makes a huge difference. When we switched engines from the hot rod engine that was in it, the little 800 or 900 horsepower piece to Zach's, we decided that because it was a lower RPM, we were probably going to need more clutch, but didn't have anywhere really to start with. So what we did with the car is we took, it just had a short bolt in it with a short aluminum bolt with an aluminum nut. We took the aluminum nut off, put a steel nut on to change the weight. That was just a few grams, and it made a huge difference in the way the clutch operated. The lower RPM, it gave more clutch apply because the engine that Zach's provided here has a whole lot more torque than the original engine out of this race car.
So the idea behind the whole centrifugal setup here is these engines, these hot rod engines, don't make any power if you pull them down to a low RPM. They've got to be wound up. The motor that came out of this, it's probably minimum speeds 6,500, 7,000-ish, something
maybe.
like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to run it less than that.
This motor probably would pull down to, you know, 6,800, 6,500, something like that. It's definitely a lower RPM engine. So I was thinking 58 to 5,500 minimum, and I said 68 or 65. But my little motor here is probably about 1,500 RPMs, both minimum and maximum RPM less than the other engine. But you have to have these clutches set up so when you put it in low gear and you let out the clutch and that thing leaves, it won't pull the engine down out of its power band. When it pulls the engine down below 7,000 or whatever, the clutch begins to slip, and so the motor always stays up in its peak power band. That's the whole idea behind this clutch. And also, so you'd have your engine on a rev limiter when you let out on the clutch, and depending on what your speed is, you can adjust along with the weight of your on the fingers of the clutch how hard the car leaves. If you've got the engine down at a pretty low RPM, relatively speaking, the motor sort of has to climb up and it won't leave as hard. If you've got everything set on kill, you can really have it screaming, and when you let go of that clutch, it pulls the motor down, grabs, and really takes off. So this is the ignition box that is hooked to the crank tire we talked about that actually controls when the spark plug fires. And we've got several things going on here. There's several rev limiters. This rev limiter here is the top rev limiter. It's the, when you say rev limiter, it's what you think of. It's set at 8,000. That's the maximum speed that the engine can turn. The burnout chip here is 6,600, and that's when the line lock is held down. That is the limit of the engine when you're doing a burnout. The last one here is the launch. It is also set at 6,600, and it is adjustable. This is something you might need to adjust depending on the track or whatnot. And this is the maximum engine speed that the engine can get to while you're fixing to launch the car, while the clutch is pushed in. This here is the shift light. It is also controlled through this box, and it is on the dash up there at the tack. But this is the adjustment that you would set the speed for the shift. It's set on 76. That's actually as low as this goes. It goes up to 9,800.
So a run start to finish is I pull it up to first, fire the, I start the car in neutral, I pull the shifter up to first, make sure the clutch is depressed, I put it into first gear, and then with this transmission I have to be kind of gentle. I start sliding the clutch out just a little bit, I feel it grab first gear, and then the car is rolling. And I just basically run at idle speed from the staging lanes up to the starting line, or up to the water box. Once I get into the water box, I push in the clutch, push on the brakes to stop the car. I put it into third gear. This button on the steering wheel is the line lock. There's a gauge right here that shows brake pressure. I bring it up to 400 psi and I push the button. You see the light on the dash over here, the red light? That's the indicator that the line lock is on. My foot is no longer on the brake and it is holding 400 psi on the front brakes. So I bring the engine RPM up to about 2,000 and I ease the clutch out nice and gentle until I feel the transmission engage. Just because the shifter's in third doesn't mean it's in gear. So I feel the shifter engage. Once I do that, then I bring it up to about 5,000 RPM and I let the clutch out pretty quick. That gets the tire spinning. Shift fourth, fifth, and basically I'm almost wide open throttle. I try not to be on the rev limiter super hard, but I have to keep enough power to keep the wheels spinning. Once I feel like the burnout is over, then I can let go of the button on the steering wheel that lets go of the front brakes. I push in the clutch, step on the brakes to slow the car down or stop it. As soon as I let go of the shifter, it's back into neutral. At that point, I pull the reverse shifter and just a touch of throttle so that it's not just gonna die, and ease the clutch out and start backing the car up till I'm behind the starting line and ready. Once I get all backed up from that, I have to make sure that I get the shifter back into first gear. First gear is important. It will take off in any gear, it doesn't care. So then I let the clutch out nice and gentle and ease up to the starting line. As I start getting close to the starting line, I again mash the brakes, and I'm talking within a foot of the starting line or so. I set the brakes at 400 psi again, and that's just enough pressure that it'll keep the car from rolling, but not like skid a tire or anything. So at that point, then I use the clutch pedal and I bring the RPM up to about 2500, and I slip the clutch just enough to get the car into pre-stage, make sure everything's ready. I turn my computer on, hit the record button, make sure the shifter's in first gear once again, and then I bring the engine RPM up to about 3500 and go on in and stage the car. Once the car is staged, I'm holding the line lock, I'm holding it in low gear, I put the gas pedal on the floor, and when the tree fires, dump the clutch and let go of the button at the same time. And from there, it's just shift away. First gear, second, third, fourth, fifth, at about that speed. When I get to the finish line, I push in the clutch, let go of the shifter, it's in neutral, and we're just coasting down and using the brakes to stop and get off the racetrack.
He said turn the computer on. Here's the computer. It's got an accelerometer and there's several RPM sensors. I don't think you're measuring oil pressure or anything like that,
No.
are you? So after the pass, we can plug a laptop into this, and what we're doing is monitoring engine RPM and driveline speed and input speed to the transmission. And that's showing the clutch slippage, and that's how you can know whether your clutch is too tight or too loose by the RPM that it stalls at effectively.
And then we use the G meter to also tell us if our shift points are correct. You know, if we're running the engine too far up in RPM and out of its power range, the accelerometer, the G meter, will fall off. And so we can learn from that. If we're shifting at, say, 7600 right now, and the G meter falls off at the top of every gear, then we'll lower that RPM to, say, like 73, 7200, and see if we can get more in the power band of the engine, and the car will actually run quicker.
So I think we bored you enough of talking about the car. Let's talk about the race night and how that went. We had this thing up on a lift, and I actually screwed the oil filter on it after we changed the oil in this engine at noon, and we were supposed to make our first pass at 1 o'clock. Anyway, we got there late, obviously, bounced the car out of the trailer, fired it up, got a little bit of heat in the motor. He jumped in it, we rolled up to the starting line and blasted off. And you got to remember, this is kind of a new setup for him. I mean, he's drove the car, but the engine's making more torque. It's probably leaving a little bit harder.
Way less RPM.
Way less RPM. It's just in the first pass, the clutch was significantly tighter than it ended up being. We had it apart. It must something wear in. I don't know exactly what's going on, but it launched really hard. But he blasted off through there and hit every shift point. Just square, just perfect. You couldn't have done any better. And the car went at 577. That's 5.77 seconds elapsed time over an eighth mile. And we were talking, we figured that's about 1 second exactly 0 to 60 time. The car ran really, really good. First rattle out of the box, you know, it was actually the fastest pass that went all night. And we didn't have time to get a camera in the car. I got my camera set up in the car on the next pass, which is actually the second qualifying pass. And let's just take a look at it. So this is a pass y'all have already seen. This is the second pass, but let's digest on it just a little bit. Let's watch this again at 1/4 speed. He's got a shift light beside the tach there. You can't see it very well on the camera, but it comes on at 7,600 RPMs. Maximum engine speed is 8,000. Watch the tach and see how precisely he hits all 4 shifts. Once again, normal speed.
So, like Zach said, we missed the first qualifier, which was okay. We got just a time trial run, a time only test pass before we went up for the second official qualifying pass. First pass went great, way better than expected. Kind of got the nerves shook off of me as a driver again, because everything is new and fresh and you don't know, and the engine's been setting for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, I don't know, for a long time. So you know, you've got all these thoughts running through your head of what could be. Anyway, first pass, everything was great. Hit the shift points pretty close. Came back, felt like we had everything pretty well locked in. Part of the rules on this class is we had to declare our index before we made our second qualifying pass. So that test pass really helped us. So we picked our index at a 576, I think is what it was, based on that we just run a 577. And then we got the camera in the car for the second qualifying pass, the first official pass that we were making for the timing sheets and qualifying order. The car slowed down a little bit, ran a 580.
Like 81
or something like that. We'll show you all the time slips here with the videos and stuff, but not really sure why. We don't have any explanation for that, but you know, that's stuff we're going to look at and try to figure out as we go.
So I got you all zoomed down here on this time slip. Matt was in the right lane here. Often these are given to the driver on the way back. They sort of get wadded up and hard to read. So up here, the first number is a dial in. They didn't put a dial in, but he actually had already had to declare his index, and it was a 5.76 seconds. The reaction, this number here, is how long after the light turned green that the car actually left. So the car left almost 0.18 of a second after the light turned green. The next number here is a 60-foot time. This is the time that elapsed from the time the car left until it traveled 60 feet. This 60 feet time, you can put this in a calculator. The car was running probably about 68 miles an hour at 60 feet at 1.23 seconds. This comes out probably a 0 to 60 time. I bet is close to 1.05. I was trying to do some math. It's just right over a 1 second 0 to 60 miles an hour. This is more than twice as fast as any production car that I'm aware of. The next is a 330-foot time. This is 1/2 the way to the 8th mile, 3.74 seconds. At an 8th mile, it traveled an 1/8 of a mile in 5.8127 seconds. And it went to the speed at the end at 115.86 miles an hour.
So we were talking about the index thing here a second ago. If you don't know what index racing is, we'll explain all that at the very end of this video. It's kind of complicated, but it's kind of simple.
It's a lot easier to understand if you're driving the car. If you're explaining to somebody, it's a little bit abstract. And so we're gonna try to explain all that at the end, but this for now, roll with us.
So we actually had 2 races at this event. We had our first race, then we had a qualifying session, a single qualifying session, and then a second race the same evening. For the first race, not exactly sure where I qualified. It wasn't super great, I don't think, but at any rate, I had to run a 61 or 2 Corvette. For whatever reason, I was crazy late on the light. So was the other guy by chance, but he had his a little bit more figured out than me. It was the 3rd pass on the car with this engine and first round jitters, and I don't know, I have 1,000 excuses, and the end result was a yellow time slip that said I lost. So at that point, we were done for that race. That race continued on with the existing cars. There was 6 cars at this event. And so those guys worked their way through the rounds until they had a winner. Once they had a winner, then we came back and did a second qualifying session. For the second qualifying session, we were allowed to change our index if we so chose. And so we did. We were a AA modified production. We went to A modified production. Went from a 576 to a 592 index because the car had slowed down through the day. So we decided to lower that index to the next one down that's allowed for us, and we ran off that one instead. So for the qualifying session for the second race we had, I went up there, did my burnout, everything was good and normal. I felt like I was maybe a little bit out of the groove, kind of hard to say for sure. At any rate, when the car launched, it took off straight through first gear, but when somewhere around second gear or so, I'm thinking, I haven't looked at the video, so I don't know for sure. I'm just kind of rolling back through memory. The car got loose and I aborted the run. Once I lift, I'm finished. There's no opportunity to be had by staying on the car and trying to run it out at that point. It's not worth losing a car.
Especially something this nice.
Yeah, it's not worth losing a car over any round of racing. The damage it does, you can never win back, even if you're racing for money. So as it turned out, first round, I had to race this car's owner, Darrell Reid. My deal with Darrell is super great. We don't have any marching orders or directives of I have to lay down and lose intentionally. It's all out, best man wins type scenario, as good as it gets. I really got pretty lucky. Had a little bit better light than he did, and reaction time wise, and somehow got the win light at the end of the run. So the next round that we had was the finals. There only ended up being 4 cars for the second race, and I knew I was in trouble. So a whole series of events had happened. The car was running considerably better for some reason. It woke itself back up. I could run under my index, which would cause me to lose. But the biggest difficulty I had was the brakes went out. And the brakes had gone out a few rounds before. But it's one of those things that you don't necessarily want to talk about. You don't want your competitors to know, because they can use that against you. Not necessarily an unsafe scenario, so don't think that. I could pump them up, get the brakes to work. But they just weren't there on the first pump. First pump, the pedal goes to the floor. Second, third pump, then the brakes work plenty fine. But that does make the driving a little more difficult in that when I step on the pedal, I didn't have the brake authority that I was expecting. So I had to think about this an extra step of pumping the pedal to have brakes. So for the final round, I wasn't stellar on the tree, and in that run, the little Camaro got quite the head start. So it was a staggered start. The little Camaro got the head start on me by about 1.5 seconds. And so I have to wait on the starting line, which causes some jitters and stuff too in itself, because you're sitting there wide open on the throttle with it on the rev limiter, waiting on the Christmas tree, the lights to come down and fire to launch the car. Anyway, enough excuses. I was a little late on the light. The car had picked up a lot. I got down to the finish line and I was chasing him down. He was going slow. I was coming up behind him, overtaking him, and I was trying to judge the finish line stripe. I knew it was going a little fast. I tried to get on the brakes. There wasn't enough brakes to slow me down, and I broke out. I went too fast.
So ultimately, that's about the end of this video as far as the race went, the race car and the race car stuff. But if you don't understand what index racing is, how a bracket race works, that's what's up next. That's the only thing that's up next. If you want to find out, hang out just a minute. A bracket race and an index race, and I'm going to kind of use those interchangeably, are similar, but they're not exactly the same thing. A car like this, you have to pick your index.
There's a published list.
Yeah, they're about 1/10 apart or something like that, 1/10 second or something to that effect. A bracket race is similar, but the difference is you can pick any number and you can change it at any point of the night. And typically people will, as the night gets cooler, your car will run a little bit faster, and you might pick a 1 or 2 hundredths of a second lower index as the night goes on. ET.
With this index racing that we're doing, once we write it on the window for our second qualifying session, before we go down the track on our second qualifying session, we're locked in for the rest of that event, for the rest of that race event. So since we had 2 races on this one, we got to actually change it before we went to the second event on the same night.
And a bracket race is set up so that a person that is the best driver wins, not the fastest car. And so you've got a Christmas tree, and you've got 2 bulbs that come on as you roll into the first beam. It's the pre-stage. The second bulb is the stage. Once both cars are staged, they'll begin a countdown of 6 amber lights. There's 3 on each side. If you have a car that runs a 6.0 and the car running next to you runs a 7.0, 7 seconds versus 6 seconds elapsed time, the person running your opponent will get a 1 second head start. And so his lights will start coming down before yours. The lights are a 1/2 second apart. Okay, so let's say you're running a 6.0 index, a 6 second elapsed time. That's your dial in. The top amber bulb comes on, 1/2 second the next, 1/2 second the next, 1/2 second after that, the green comes on. You leave when the light turns green. If you leave before the light turns green, you get a red light. That's an automatic immediate loss. Your elapsed time, your actual time, starts when you leave, not when the light turns green. And this is where a lot of people get confused. When the light turns green, your timer does not start. Your timer starts when the actual stage beam, this measuring where your front tire is opened up.
When he explains the staging beam, there's 2 laser beams going across the racetrack on each side. And when a front tire blocks the first beam, that turns on the first light on the Christmas tree.
The pre-stage bulb.
The pre-stage. And about 11 inches later, the car moves about 11 inches or so, then the second light comes on, and then you're locked in and ready for the tree to start doing its timing.
So when you launch, if you sit there for a long period, like an extra second, the light turns green and you sit there for 1 second, and your opponent leaves when his turns green. He's already 1 second ahead of you when you launch. To win the race, you have to beat him to the finish line but not run faster than your index. If you run faster, it's called breaking out. If you break out, you lose. If the other person red lights first, he loses. But other than that, if you break out, you lose. It's impossible.
And if both racers break out, the one who breaks out the worst loses too.
Yeah. We're both sitting here giggling. This is impossible. So it all comes down to the times and some math. It's the person that can leave closest to when the light turns green without leaving before, and the person that can run closest to their dial in or their index without going faster than their index. This works out mathematically so that whoever does that will be the first person to the finish line to not run faster than their index. That's why Matt was talking about at the end of that last pass, he was having trouble with his brakes because he's wanting to run down there, get sort of caught up with the other car, and then get on his brakes so they're sort of run. He just barely has got a nose right in front of that other guy's car, beats him right across the line. Now the other guy had a really good light. He had already lost. You know, he didn't know that at that point. But that's why he's talking about having trouble, having to pump the brakes up, because that last, less than half a second or so, you're trying to judge the finish line right there. He didn't have the ability to hit the brakes and slow down. So I hope that we made a little bit of sense out of that. I've got to tie this back to this class because it's similar, but it's not the same thing. So in this class, you have to pick your dial and you have to pick your index from a list that's given to you, and there's a significant step between each one. It gives the racers ability to drive the car more at the end of the track, I guess is kind of the way of putting it. But anyway, this, instead of having your ambers coming down with a half second apart, which is called a full tree, they run what's called a staggered pro tree. So a standard, that's different than what I just said, staggered. A standard pro tree is where all 6 bulbs come on for 4/10 of a second. That's what you see in NHRA events. It's just bang and go. There's no countdown. It's very quick, happens very fast. This is a staggered pro tree so that there's still the handicap start. If the person next to you runs slower than you, they get a head start. Their lights in green come on before yours, but you don't have the countdown. It's just you get your 3 bulbs, you get a 4/10 of a second flash, and it's green. Give that my best shot. I hope you kind of got an idea of how the race works. Like I say, if you're in a car, it's really easy to understand. If you're on the finish line, but it's a little bit abstract if you're just talking about it. I guess that's about the size of it. Appreciate y'all watching. Matt just said need to see if y'all can come up with any good names for the car. It doesn't really have a name. If y'all got any good suggestions, leave them in the comments. I guess that's it.
That's it.
Appreciate y'all watching. Catch you on the next one.
See ya.